This is the second presentation provided by the Education Quality Assurance Unit to give an overview of programme approval and monitoring processes. Next, I will give a brief outline on the programme approval and monitoring processes. In the case of programme approval, when an education provider is satisfied that there is sufficient evidence to demonstrate that the programme meets the Registration Board's requirement, they may submit a programme approval application form, which is available on the Carew website, to the Education Quality Assurance Unit, who will in turn notify the Registration Board that the application has been received. Members of the Carew executive will meet with the provider to discuss the programme approval process and address any questions that arise. Key documents such as criteria and standards, mapping documents and visit schedules are shared and explained. In the case of programme monitoring, the Carew executive will contact the education provider no more than 3 years since the programme was originally approved to notify them that they will begin the programme monitoring process. A submission for programme approval or monitoring consists of 2 parts: documentation and a review team visit to the education provider. The documentation and visit are used to determine whether the programme meets the Registration Board's requirements. Following an initial check by the Carew executive that all required documentation has been submitted, it is shared with the review team. Each review team member then completes an individual review of the documentation and completes an observation template, which is returned to Carew. The review team then meet to discuss the submission. These initial observations are shared with the education provider, who may, but is not required to, submit further evidence in relation to the observations shared. In the week before the visit to the education provider, the review team meet again. This is an opportunity to review any further documentation submitted by the education provider and prepare questions for the education provider during the visit. During the visit, the review team consider any oral evidence or additional documentary evidence provided following their questions. Following full review of the documentary evidence and discussion during the visit, the review team will work with the Carew executive to produce an observations report for the Registration Board to consider. The observations report lists each criterion and standard, and they must be placed into either Section 1 or Section 2 of the report, based on the documentary evidence received, oral evidence from the visit, and the review team's interpretation of the criterion or standard. Section 1 of the report will list the criteria and standards of proficiency where, in the view of the review team, relevant and sufficient evidence has been submitted. Section 2 of the report will list the criteria and standards of proficiency where, in the review of the review team, some aspects of the evidence needs to be brought to the Registration Board's attention. Criteria and standards may need to be included in Section 2 of the report where there is no documentary evidence, the documentary evidence is irrelevant or insufficient, the provider has given only oral evidence, the oral evidence and documentary evidence are contradictory, the interpretation of a requirement has to be highlighted to the Registration Board. Where a criterion and standard is listed in Section 2 of the report, the review team must also write a rationale explaining the reason for bringing the evidence in respect of this criterion and standard to the Registration Board's attention. The rationale must make it clear what the problem is and not suggest how it could be addressed. The rationale must be evidence-based, rational and logical. Following the completion of the visit, the review team will submit their observations report to the Registration Board for their considering. The review team do not disclose any information with the education provider at this point. The Registration Board will have the opportunity to consider the application over 2 registration board meetings. At the first meeting, the registration board will be provided with the observations report and documentary evidence submitted by the education provider. They will have the opportunity to discuss any items listed in section 2 and inform the provider of any concerns in relation to the criteria and standards. And they will provide the education provider with an opportunity to submit further documentary evidence. The report will be set out as follows. The introduction will provide an overview of the approval and monitoring activity, including review team membership, details of the education provider and the education programme. Section 1 of the report will list each criteria and standard for education and training programmes, where, in the view of the review team, the standards have been met. Section 2 will list each criteria and standard where the evidence submitted by the education provider requires additional consideration by the registration board. Evidence may require additional consideration for a variety of reasons mentioned previously, including instances where the documentary evidence is not relevant or sufficient, where no evidence has been submitted, or where oral evidence alone has been provided. A rationale would be provided by the review team as to why they have included the indicator in section 2 and to highlight those aspects of the evidence which require the registration board's attention. Registration board members can approach their review of the documentation however they choose. We suggest the following approach. Review the report, and in particular those items listed in section 2 of the report. And this will include considering the rationale as set out by the review team as to why the criterion has not been met. Review of the submitted documentary evidence as described in the report and available to the review team in the registration board portal to determine if the registration board members agree with the opinion of the review team. Once all criteria and standards listed in section 2 have been considered, the registration board member may then wish to review documentary evidence submitted for those criteria listed in section 1. Again, you may find it useful to use the mapping document to identify the documentary evidence submitted by education providers in relation to each criteria or standard. The registration board have the opportunity to move both items from section 2 of the report to section 1 if they are satisfied it meets the criteria. They may also add new items to section 2 if, in their opinion, the criteria have not been met. However, as mentioned earlier, if a new item is added to section 2, the registration board must have a clear evidence-based rationale for doing so. This is to ensure the provider can understand your opinion and to assist the provider to respond adequately to your findings. Following the registration board meeting, the report is updated if any changes are made and approved by the chair of the registration board. Then it is issued to the education provider. This purpose is twofold. It allows the education provider to review the report and respond to any issues of factual accuracy identified, and it allows the education provider to submit further documentary evidence in relation to the criteria which, in the opinion of the registration board, have not been met. It is important to note that the education provider is not obliged to submit any further documentary evidence. The programme approval or monitoring application will then be brought to a second registration board meeting. This will allow the board the opportunity to discuss any further documentary evidence if submitted and make a final decision regarding the programme approval or monitoring application. If the programme approval application is approved, the qualification can be added to the approved qualification bylaw for the registration board. If it is refused, the education provider can make a request to the Minister as outlined previously. If after programme monitoring, the decision of the registration board is to continue approval, the Minister will be notified. If after programme monitoring the board is of the opinion that the programme is no longer suitable for the education and training of candidates for registration, it can withdraw its approval. The education provider has the opportunity within 30 days to make representations to the board as to why the approval should not be withdrawn. And they have the opportunity to make a request to the Minister. Thank you for taking the time to review these presentations. If you have any questions, please contact us by emailing education@carew.ie.